China has again laid out its stance on the trade war in a government white paper over the weekend. In the document, China highlighted how the tariff war has hurt both economies, especially for the U.S., and blamed Washington solely for the breakdown in trade talks. While last month the U.S. had accused China of reneging on the certain terms of the deal, this white paper cited 3 instances when the U.S. broke their word. The paper said once again that China is willing to engage, but with preconditions. This is the second time that China published such a white paper. The first one was published last September. What new messages is China sending the world with this document? And as both sides exchange punitive actions, is there a light at the end of the tunnel? Joining us in the studio is Stratford, Chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in China, and from Shanghai, Professor Qian Jun, Executive Dean of Fudan University's Fanhai International School of Finance. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Now, first of all, let me ask our guests about the timing of this white paper. We understand that just a day after China raised tariffs against American goods as a kind of retaliation against the U.S.'s latest round on Chinese tariffs on Chinese goods. Tim, do you see this white paper as some kind of a letter of explanation or a letter of challenge or whatever?
It's probably a little bit of both. We're very glad to see that the white paper begins by saying that the commercial relationship between the two countries has been the propeller and the ballast of the overall relationship. And as American companies doing business in China, we're proud of the contribution we've made to economic development in China, to employment, and we think we've developed very good relations with our counterparts here. So we think that's very positive. Obviously, we're distressed to see that after so much hard work by the negotiators from both governments, and we think the negotiators on both sides have been very professional and have worked very hard, we're very disappointed to see that this process has broken down for the time being. And it's understandable that the Chinese government would want to give its own view of why that happened. The U.S., of course, gave a very different view.
Yeah. Well, some journalists, foreign journalists based in China, picked up some key messages, although it's very simplistic. But, for instance, saying that China is saying in this white paper that China is the grown-up, that China is the victim, China wants to talk, but only as an equal, and that China will fight the U.S. for as long as it takes. And some are saying that this white paper is not very different from the first white paper, which was released last September. What is your take? Did you read anything different between the lines? I mean, the numbers of the damage to the economies, of course, are new, right? We have observed more time lapse between, when the tariffs were first introduced to now. But other than that, any new positions, any change of tone that you have observed?
Well, I think it doesn't help put the negotiations back on track to say that the fault of the breakdown is completely on the other side. I think any of us who have been married know that whenever there's a dispute, there are good reasons on both sides, and I think that this may be a kind of a posturing document, but I hope that the governments will soon go into their closed rooms and give each other enough political space to sort out the problems that remain to be resolved.
Professor Qian, let me go to you. I would like to know how you look at the tone and the content of this white paper. Professor Qian, if you're with me. Hello, Professor Qian?
Yes.
Yes. So help us understand exactly what is the position of the Chinese government to come up with the white paper at this particular moment. Of course, the tone is very strong, and it, as I said, put the blame solely on the American side. It actually listed 3 instances when where the Chinese believes the American broke their word, because we actually do not know exactly what happened behind closed doors. So help us understand the situation a little bit more.
So clearly, first of all, now it's a difficult time. It's also very uncertain, not just for these 2 countries, but also for the entire world. I was actually in Europe 2 weeks ago. People obviously around the world are watching what's being developed here. So certainly I can understand that the Chinese government is obligated to give their side of the story. But one point I actually agree with the other guest, is that if you read the report, it actually spends a lot of time talking about how trade is important for both sides, and not having this good trade relationship would hurt both sides. And then if you read the beginning, the middle, and the very end, yes, it is a very strong worded report, but it also states the position of the Chinese government, and that is they are willing to talk, but obviously they feel that such continuation in talks should be laid out in some ground rules. And I think that actually gives me hope that talks will continue because, as I said, this is a difficult time. If the report if the content of the report is just putting the blame on the other side or explaining their own position, it will be quite different as compared to what you actually read. Is the report spends data, statements from not only from China but also from the U.S. on how this will hurt both sides, and that I think that's important. I think that's important.
Okay, Tim, what's your take on that situation? I mean, I saw you nodding a little bit. Did you read a little bit of that signal as well? That although China's word is very strong, almost harsh in that, and blaming entirely the Washington for bringing down the talks, but the underlying tone is we have both been hurt.
Well, I think there's acknowledgement of that. I mean, I think everyone knows that for the talks to break down is a suboptimal result for both countries. Trade is beneficial to both countries, and the problem is that if each side gives ultimatums to the other side in a public setting, then there's no space for either side to back down without facing a huge political cost domestically. And so I think it's unfortunate that the breakdown has become as public as it has. I think the most optimistic scenario that I can think of right now is for the two presidents to meet at the G20 meeting at the end of June, and for them to walk out and say, we have agreed to resume the negotiations. They don't have to say anything else than that. And if they say that much, then we'll get our professional negotiators back in a room, and nobody has to say that either has surrendered to the other side.
Yeah. Well, the Chinese side had laid out some preconditions. I mean, and this is not the first time that we've heard that unless the U.S. side treat the Chinese side with respect as equal, just as the Chinese side treat the U.S., then this is not going to work. Tim, you have been in China long enough. I would speculate that you understand what it means. But do you think the message is getting across to the American side, or do you think this is the Americans just don't see this as the core of the problem?
So I've been talking with trade negotiators from both governments, and what I've heard is that actually, if you talk about Ambassador Lighthizer and Vice Premier Liu He, that they have a very good relationship, and that there was a lot of give and take, and that there was a lot of careful vetting, and each side tried to consider the thoughts of the other side. So I think that there's been a big effort to try to be respectful, and again, I think that when things break down, it's sort of political nature to try to blame the other side. But I think that when the negotiators have been talking, that they've actually shown a lot of sensitivity, and there's been a lot of give and take, and that they've gone line by line through an agreement that was described as 150 pages long, trying to reach agreement on tests and being sensitive to both sides.
Yeah. So, Professor Qian, what is your take on this precondition that China has attached? Basically, China has said we don't want a trade war. We are not afraid of a trade war, but if we are forced to fight one, we are going to fight one. Again, for us Chinese, it's probably fairly clear, but help us translate into one simple sentence and try to make the American people understand it, if you can.
It's interesting. I also spent a lot of time in the U.S. As a student, as a professor. So from the outside, you look at China. A lot of people know that it is the Chinese tradition that they want to feel they're being respected. That is something that's important for them. I don't know whether that's one of the reasons that these phrases are included. But on the other hand, again, I think it's important for both sides to give their story. But I think recently, at least recently, if you look at everything that's been happening, and again, as I said, I was in Europe. I think a lot of people felt like if you look beyond what's going on between the negotiation between China and the U.S., if you look at what happened to other countries, I think there's a view, or there's an increasing trend of other countries felt that maybe the U.S. position, in particular the government's position, on this understanding of having a trade system or a trade relation is problematic. So again, if you step outside these bilateral languages and reports, I tend to concur with that. If you look at what's been happening just the last few weeks, I actually think that a lot of people view this as not a good trend in terms of how many bilateral and multilateral relations are now in jeopardy.
Yeah.
Tim,
okay.
So again.
Yeah. Sorry, Professor Qian. Let me ask for Tim to jump in here. You want to chip in here?
I think. I think that many of us in the business community have been concerned about a similar thing. I think that the U.S. has been picking multiple battles at the same time. We have, the renegotiation of the agreement with Canada and Mexico. We have discussions with Japan. We have discussions with Europe, and of course discussions with China. And I think there has been some concern that the U.S. has been going it alone rather than seeking consensus with like-minded trading partners. And so I think that's a fair criticism, and many of us wish that the U.S. would be a little bit more focused.
You said once that there will be light at the end of the tunnel, if I remember clearly. But where are we at this moment? I mean, are we in the beginning of the tunnel? Are we in the middle of it, or is it a curving? Is it a curve that we're seeing?
I think we're at a very challenging time. But let me try to describe a silver lining. Okay, I had a couple of concerns before the negotiations broke down.
Yeah.
One of the concerns was that it would be very difficult to implement the agreement, even if we got a very good agreement, because not everybody in the Chinese government would necessarily have agreed. The discussions have taken place in a pretty small group. So it was quite possible that other departments within the Chinese government would be rather hesitant to implement an agreement. Now, because of the way that the agreement has been discussed more broadly within the senior leadership of China, I think if we can get agreement, there'll be a more solid basis for implementation. The second silver lining, I was concerned that we would have an agreement, and then the next week, the U.S. would put Huawei on the entity list, and all the goodwill that had been created from the agreement would be dissolved because of that action. So now that's also out there, because now, when we do get a deal, all of these other factors will have been put in, and we'll be on a more stable footing.
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk about that entity list in just a moment, right after this short break. Tim Stratford and Professor Qian Jun from Fudan University.